At first glance, war in Iran looks like a gift to the Kremlin. Oil jumps. The world's attention shifts. Russian television gets fresh material about Western hypocrisy. Another anti-Western regime is under attack, which means Moscow can posture as the calm, responsible adult in the room. So the easy conclusion is obvious: this helps Putin. But that conclusion is too shallow. Because the same war that seems to rescue Moscow is also exposing something far more dangerous for the Kremlin: how weak its camp really is, how fragile its alliances are, and how little control Russia actually has when one of its key partners starts burning. That's the false rescue. I am Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union, and today I want to show you why the Iran war doesn't make Russia stronger. It gives Moscow a few short-term headlines, yes, but underneath that, it makes Russia poorer, weaker, more isolated, and more anxious about its own future. Here's our roadmap. 3 realities. How the same war produces 3 totally different stories. Oil is not salvation. Why higher prices don't solve Moscow's real problem. No relief for Russians. Why extra money goes to war, not normal life. Severed supplies. How Iran's troubles weaken Russia's military machine. A useless patron. How this war exposes the fragility of Russia's anti-Western camp. A mirror for Moscow. Why Russian elites are watching Iran like a preview of themselves. The end of oil blackmail. Why every oil war teaches the world to escape oil autocracies faster. If you value independent analysis, subscribe, like, and share. You can also join my think tank, support through PayPal or Super Thanks, or tap Hype Points. And if you are listening on Spotify, please follow the show there too. It really helps. Now, let's begin with the first thing this war reveals. Not one reality, but 3. 3 realities. The war in Iran is being understood in the West through 2 very different realities. The first is strategic. In this version, people look at maps, missiles, oil routes, proxy forces, nuclear risks, and military logistics. They ask whether Iran's regional power is being reduced, whether its ability to arm allies is being damaged, and whether the balance of power in the Middle East is shifting. In that reality, the war is judged not by its beauty, but by its consequences. It is seen as brutal, dangerous, and necessary. The second is humanitarian. In this version, the focus is not on strategy, but on suffering. Burned buildings, crushed neighborhoods, families running with children in their arms, hospitals under pressure, fear spreading faster than facts. In that reality, the war is not a chessboard, but a human catastrophe, and the language is the language of grief. Civilian deaths, displacement, escalation, trauma, collapse. Those 2 realities exist side by side across much of the Western conversation. One asks whether the war weakens a dangerous regime, the other asks how much human pain is being normalized in the process. But Russian propaganda offers a third reality entirely. In the Russian press, this war is explained in a way that is immediately familiar. The plot never really changes. America and its allies create chaos. The Middle East is once again set on fire by the West. International law is said to be trampled. Diplomacy is said to be ignored, and Russia, as always, casts itself in the role it adores most. The calm, responsible power watching reckless Western arsonists burn another region of the world. This performance would be laughable if it were not so useful. A state that invaded Ukraine, bombed cities, and turned civilian infrastructure into a military target now lectures others about stability. A government that treats international law as disposable wraps itself in the vocabulary of order and peace. Another argument matters just as much. If Israel and the United States can strike whoever they choose, why should Russia pretend it has no such right? Then comes the next layer, the one designed to trigger a rally around the flag response. Today, Iran, tomorrow, Russia. The message is simple and emotionally powerful. The West does not want compromise. It wants submission. The strike on Tehran is presented as proof that Russia was right all along to arm itself, harden itself, and prepare for a long civilizational confrontation. Oil is not salvation. For one brief moment, the Iran war looked like salvation for the Kremlin. Oil prices jumped hard for a country like Russia, where oil and gas still sit near the center of state finance. That kind of move feels like a godsend. If you stop there, you might think, well, that's it. Russia got lucky again. War in the Middle East will keep Putin afloat. But this is where the deeper reality kicks in. Higher prices matter only if you can actually sell the oil. And this is where Russia's problem begins, because Ukraine has not been politely waiting for oil markets to rescue the Kremlin. Ukraine has been hitting the infrastructure that turns oil in the ground into money in the budget. By late March, at least 40% of Russia's oil export capacity had been halted after Ukrainian drone strikes, a disputed pipeline hit, and tanker seizures. All three major Western export routes were affected. Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, Primorsk and Ust-Luga on the Baltic. Reuters called it the most severe oil supply disruption in modern Russian history. A high oil price is only useful if you can move the oil. If the ports are damaged, the pumping stations are hit, and the tankers are seized, then the price spike becomes near useless. No relief for Russians. Yes, a war in Iran can push oil prices up for a while, and that does help the Russian budget. But it will not make ordinary Russians richer or happier. The old oil bargain is over. In the 2000s, the Kremlin used energy money to make life feel better. Higher incomes, more consumer goods, cleaner cities, more visible comfort. That was part of the deal. Stay out of politics, and the state will share some of the oil windfall. Wartime Russia works differently. Now, extra money does not go into normal life, but into war and control. Even before this latest oil spike, Moscow was discussing cuts to what officials called non-sensitive spending. That usually means the things ordinary people depend on: roads, schools, clinics, housing repairs, local infrastructure, and public services. In other words, the state is already signaling that civilian life can be squeezed further. What cannot be squeezed is everything the regime needs to survive. The army must be financed. Soldiers must be paid. Families of the dead and wounded must be compensated. Defense factories must keep running. Regional elites must be kept loyal. The security services must be funded. Propaganda must continue. That is where the money goes. Severed supplies. Iran mattered to Russia far more than Russian propaganda likes to admit. In Ukraine, Iran helped Russia learn how to kill more cheaply. Iran pioneered the Shahed drone that turned long-range terror into something mass-produced and relatively cheap. Since then, Russia has launched those drones in hundreds, stretching Ukraine's air defenses. And Russia's cooperation with Iran went deeper than just buying the drones. In 2024, senior Russian missile specialists had flown to Iran several times amid deeper military ties between Moscow and Tehran. Their exact tasks were not publicly confirmed, but you do not send that kind of people on that kind of route for tourism. This was a military expertise exchange between two sanctioned powers trying to learn from each other and prepare for a harsher world. That is why the war in Iran matters to Moscow in a very practical sense. If Iran is degraded, distracted, or forced to focus inward, then Russia loses one of its strongest allies. This does not mean Russia suddenly runs out of drones tomorrow. That would be too simple. Russia has already localized a great deal of production. It copies, adapts, and scales. In March, Zelensky said that it was Russia now supplying Iran with Shahed drones. A strange reversal that shows how far the wartime cooperation has evolved. But that is exactly the point. Russia's relationship with Iran has become a two-way military corridor, a channel of technology, production logic, experience, and political support among two regimes under pressure. If Iran's infrastructure is damaged, if its military priorities turn inward, if its command structure is shaken, if it has to spend its best attention on survival at home, then it has less capacity for Russia, less military assistance of any kind. That's bad news for Moscow. And there is more to come. A useless patron. A great power is supposed to protect its clients. That is the whole point of being a patron. You must prove that those who stand with you will not be left alone when real danger comes. And this is exactly where Russia now looks weak. On paper, Moscow is still trying to play the role. It condemns escalation. It talks about diplomacy. It offers mediation. It tries to look serious, responsible, and indispensable. But when you strip away the theater, what do we actually see? We see Russia asking for a ceasefire so it can evacuate its own people from Iran's Bushehr nuclear plant. That is not patronage. That is self-preservation. And this is not a small detail. Bushehr is one of the most visible symbols of long-term Russian-Iranian cooperation. Russia built the plant and stayed involved there for years. If even in that case Moscow's instinct is not to "we will secure this space," but "please let us evacuate our people," the message is loud enough for everyone to hear. Then there is the language itself. Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for the Russian president, said Russia was ready to help resolve the conflict. This is the language of a country that has no decisive tools left, only phrases. A real patron doesn't just comment on events, it changes them. Russia can still do some things, of course. It can help partners evade sanctions, sell technology, or provide diplomatic cover. For weak or isolated regimes, that still has value, but value is not the same thing as protection. And that is the problem now. Moscow built much of its prestige on the image of being the reliable strongman outside the Western system, the power that would do business when the West turned away, the power that would keep you safe if you pledge allegiance. That image worked until Iran tested it too hard. What this war shows is that Russia cannot reliably save you when actually military pressure lands on your head. And once that becomes obvious, Russia's whole anti-Western brand starts to sag. For years, the Kremlin wanted to be seen as the center of a rival world. But this war shows that Russia is not really the head of that world. At best, it is one moderate members of it. Louder than the others, perhaps, but no safer, no stronger, and much less useful than it pretends. A mirror for Moscow. For the Kremlin, this war is not only a foreign policy problem, but also a mirror. Russian elites are looking at Iran and see something they would rather not see. A stress test for autocracy under real pressure. Bombs, dead commanders, damaged infrastructure, evacuation, fear, uncertainty, shrinking room for mistakes. And the first lesson is cruel. Autocratic systems can look solid right up to the moment when they stop looking solid at all. US and Israeli strikes had hollowed out Iran's inner circle, killing top military and security advisors and raising the risk of strategic mistakes. As the Russian elite looks at this, they keep asking the same question. If this can happen to them, can it happen to us? And there are two possible answers, two scenarios. The first is the regime survives scenario. Iran remains damaged, poorer, more brutal, and more cut off from the world, but the ruling group stays in place. The state becomes uglier, but still stands. That would be a soothing lesson for Russian elites. It would tell them that ruin is survivable, that a country can lose comfort, infrastructure, outside respect, and still keep the same people at the top as long as those people hold the guns and the scarce resources. The second is the regime cracks scenario. This is the one that scares them, because it would show that even a hardened authoritarian system can be shaken much faster than insiders expect. So Russian elites are watching very closely to see what happens after ceasefire. They know it could become a scenario for them too. The end of oil blackmail. Here's the final irony. Every oil war looks at first like a triumph for oil autocracies. Prices jump, panic spreads. They imagine the world has no choice but to come crawling back, wallet in hand, begging for fuel. And for a short while, that feeling is real. We're watching it now. The IEA chief said the current oil and gas shock is worse than 1973, 1979, and 2022 combined. In Europe, officials are openly discussing rationing and emergency reserves. But here's what oil autocracies never seem to learn. A shock also tells every buyer in the world the same thing. This product comes with political blackmail attached. That lesson does not work instantly. People do not switch off oil and gas like a lamp. Industry, transport, heating, shipping, all of it is sticky. But the direction still changes. That is what happened after the 1970s oil shocks. The first reaction was fear. The second was adaptation. Rich countries built strategic reserves, redesigned engines, improved efficiency, diversified suppliers, and started taking energy security seriously. We saw the same mechanism after Russia tried to blackmail Europe with gas. At first, Moscow thought it had found the perfect pressure point. Then Europe adapted. Messily, expensively, imperfectly, but it adapted. LNG imports grew. Shortage rules tightened. Governments subsidized the pain. Industry adjusted. Now it would be a historic mistake for Europe to drift back toward Russian gas, even in the middle of the current Middle East shock. The question to ask is not how do we return to old dependency, but how do we avoid being trapped like that again? That is the real damage oil wars do to oil autocracies. They frighten customers into thinking long term. And that is why the Iran war is bad news for Russia in the deepest sense. Yes, the Kremlin gets a little more oxygen, but the same crisis is teaching the world again why depending on unstable petrostates is dangerous. And this time, the world will probably take the lesson even more seriously. Before you go, I want to ask you something practical. If you had to bet on the biggest long-term effect of the Iranian war, What would it be? Higher oil prices? A weaker Russian-Iran axis? More pressure on Ukraine? A faster move away from oil dependence? Or something else most people are still missing? If this video helped you see the mechanism more clearly, please like the video and subscribe. Share it with one person who still thinks the Iran war is simply good news for Putin. And if you want to support this work directly, you can join my think tank or use PayPal or Super Thanks. You can also tap high points to help this episode travel further. And if you are listening on Spotify, hit follow so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for watching. See you next time.